Hello and welcome to Fortifying Financial Data, Kubernetes Best Practices. Today's webinar is sponsored by Kasten by Veeam and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Scott Pecker and I'm from Actual Tech Media, and I'm excited to be your moderator for this special event. Now, before we get to today's great content, we do have a few housekeeping items that will help you get the most out of this session. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in your webinar control panel. Not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that you ask. That Q&A panel is also the place to let us know about any technical issues that you might be experiencing. A browser refresh will fix most audio, video, and slide advancement issues. But if that doesn't work, just let us know in the Q&A and we'll provide further technical assistance. Now, second, in the handout section of your webinar control panel, you'll find that we're offering several resources, and I'd especially like to call your attention to a link to get started with Kasten K10, which you'll be hearing more about as we go. Those resources also include a link to the Gorilla Guide Book Club, where you can get access to Actual Tech Media's great printed resources on technology topics, as well as a link to the ATM Events Center, which has our calendar of upcoming events. So I encourage you to access those resources now and share them with your friends and colleagues. Third, at the end of this webinar event, we'll be awarding a $250 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize. The official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section. Just scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. And with that, let's get to today's fantastic content. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our presenter today, Matt Slotton. He's Principal Solutions Architect for Kasten by Veeam. Matt, great to have you here. Take it away.
Hello, everybody. My name is Matt Slotton. I'm a Principal Solutions Architect at Kasten by Veeam. I appreciate you joining today. Today, we're going to cover Fortifying Financial Data, Kubernetes Best Practices. So we'll be looking at data protection for Kubernetes. We'll be diving in, kind of start with why you would need it, how we can help you, and end with a quick demo in terms of actually seeing where the rubber hits the road. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into the deck. Obviously, if you have any questions that come up, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. I'll try my best to answer them. I'll try my best live, but it might have to wait till the end just to make sure that I can don't have to have too many eyes on too many screens. So with that, let's go ahead and dive in. All right. So we'll start. Who is Matt, right? Who's this guy? Just talk in front of you. So obviously it's my favorite subject to talk about. Love to talk about Matt. But no, we'll move through this quickly, but just to kind of set the stage, who I am and what I do. As mentioned before, I'm a principal solution architect here at Kasten. I do have a bit of FSI experience working in the financial industry over the years. Starting with, I'm going to be somewhat cagey. It's just part of it was protecting clients. So I apologize, but a lot of you can probably figure out where these or who these clients are. Starting with one of my first big projects was working for a large U.S. federal tax collection organization. I worked there for about 2 years up in the D.C. metro area. A couple of projects in between that, but then I ended up at a large APAC bank. I lived in Australia for a couple of years. That was enlightening for me in terms of having to cut my teeth on things like Monetary Authority of Singapore and obviously dealing with some of those compliance, those regulatory compliance frameworks. Skipping ahead a little bit, I worked for a large government-sponsored enterprise that's a mortgage broker back in the States. So again, you guys can probably figure out who that was. For that mortgage broker, we focused on BCDR, so defining the business continuity disaster recovery strategy. Finally, I worked for a global FinServ transfer agency and share registration. That one's probably a little bit harder to figure out. Just know if you're IPOing, this is one of those organizations that will help you with your share registration. So worked for them deploying a virtualization solution and again, having to deal with kind of US-based federal regulatory requirements. In terms of technical experience, again, I'll move through this a little bit quicker, but as I say, it's my favorite subject, BCDR strategy and planning. I've got experience, a lot of experience with virtualization and IT infrastructure, both traditional, physical, converged, and hyper-converged. Obviously, backup and recovery. We'll be focusing on backup and recovery today with Kasten, obviously. And then just across the board, AppSec, infrastructure as code, and source code security as well. So obviously, we need to make sure as we're pushing code, whether it's through GitOps or a pipeline, that is secure. So we have a bit of experience securing code and making sure again that we are complying with regulatory requirements. And lastly, API security. There's a couple of talks of me floating out there. It was when I worked for a different company, but where I covered API security in a recent breach. It was about a year ago at this point. And funnily enough, it was a large Australian telco. It was definitely an interesting use case, and definitely something that we need to be aware of, just as security and infrastructure and information technology professor. And lastly, to jump through, cloud native application architects, so dealing with things like Kubernetes, obviously containerization, Docker, starting to obviously dip my toes in GitOps and some pipeline automation to kind of bring it full circle with that code securing. And of course, cloud native backup recovery and mobility, which is what Kasten focuses on. So enough about me, but what about Kasten by Veeam? So again, hopefully you've heard of us because you're on this webinar, but if you haven't, let's dive in and just talk about a little bit what we do and how we do it. So first and foremost, we see our number one Kubernetes data protection. So important thing there to note is it's data protection. It's not just backup. So definitely something we like to harp on is, taking a backup or taking a snapshot taking a snapshot is not backup, and backup in itself is just part of the larger data protection story, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. You see our giga-ohm radar here. You can see Kasten by Veeam. We are working our way towards that GUI center, so pretty exciting there. Obviously, talk a little bit more too about our quick innovation and some of the things that are in our product today and that we're excited to introduce in the near future. So high level, let's cover off, why do we need Kubernetes data protection to begin with? So high level, set the stage. We see today that 74% of organizations think traditional and container-based applications can be backed up the same way as traditional infrastructure. Let me tell you, this is not the case. I wish it was. Honestly, it would make things much easier. But using things and, just grabbing our parent company, like using Veeam VBR to back up your worker nodes or try to back up etcd, yes, you can take snapshots. Yes, you can technically take backups. But if you try to restore that, you're not going to get back to the same application state as before, right? So it's inherently different architecturally with Kubernetes. So we need to treat data protection for Kubernetes differently. We see that 85% of companies have experienced at least one ransomware attack in the past year, and this is increasing, right? So not to drag names through the mud, so I'll be kind of careful, but just well known in the news. We've seen a large oil and gas pipeline. Living in Atlanta, it's something that I experienced about 2 years ago. Just trying to get gas, right? And it was due to a ransomware attack. We're starting to see more and more government entities and banks and in the financial services industry be subject to these ransomware attacks. So very important that we have a backup and recovery solution or a disaster recovery solution to account for those. 93% of organizations think multi-cloud support for container backup is important. That's good. It is important. We need to make sure that, again, we are backing up our workloads. Obviously, there is a benefit to the cloud. A benefit of Kubernetes is availability and scale out. But we need to make sure that for our persistent data that we can protect that and quickly restore our applications and minimize our mean time to recovery. 75% of organizations indicate a skill shortage in their Kubernetes backup and recovery teams. So we'll address this a little bit later in the presentation, but just know this is a common thing that we see. And it's understandable, right? Kubernetes is relatively new, really came full force on the scene in 2016. So, we're not even 10 years into it. And obviously the technology itself has evolved quite a bit. And a lot of times what we see is, it's people that are traditionally developers or traditionally infrastructure people, obviously are learning new technologies, learning how to operate in this fundamentally different architecture. So it's not uncommon to have some shortages of just Kubernetes expertise among organizations. So what we've seen, mentioned obviously 2016 as Kubernetes has matured, we're seeing more and more stateful applications, right? So this is one of the objections that I hear a lot is, hey, it's in Kubernetes, it's all ephemeral, we don't have any data, why would I need to back it up? If this was 2016, I'd be like, yeah, you're right. Why would you need to back that up? The thing is, it is not 2016. We are well into 2023. 2024 is just around the corner. And we are seeing a lot of persistent data end up in Kubernetes, which isn't a bad thing, right? From a performance perspective, from a time to deploy, makes things much easier when your data is next to your application. But we need to make sure that we are backing up and protecting that data, right? So here's a number of top workloads where we are seeing, obviously, Nginx, Redis, Postgres. Hopefully some of these look familiar to you. We are seeing more and more of this being deployed within Kubernetes within persistent volumes, right? So that is a sweet spot that Kasten can help you with. Aside from backing up applications, YAML, and just general configuration, obviously being able to back up that persistent volume data is really important. So high level, Kubernetes production demands more than just backup, right? So we alluded to this earlier. It's more than just backup and taking snapshots. We need to make sure we have data recovery, data security, and data freedom. So that's the demo. We'll focus on data freedom. These all obviously kind of work together. Really important here, right? So again, we need to make sure that we protect our organization, our enterprise data. We can quickly respond to things like ransomware attacks. Minimize, as I said before, that mean time to recovery, and make sure that we adhere to our RPO and RTO targets. And obviously, little thing that we harp on, and I'm sure you've heard it, especially if you're a backup administrator. Number one, taking snapshots is not backing up. And number two, your backups are useless if you can't recover from them, right? So an important thing is that, we make sure that we make it easy to back up and store those backups, but also quickly recover, whether in a test or production environment, which again, we'll quickly see later in the deck as well as in the demo. So just flaunting there again, number one, Kubernetes data protection. But high level, what is Kasten? What is Kasten by Veeam? What differentiates us from a number of other solutions in the market? I guess number one, straight to the top left, we are Kubernetes native, right? So the beautiful thing about Kubernetes is we have that distributed architecture, but also by being Kubernetes native app, we can easily see other namespaces deployed within Kubernetes, right? So we can inherently see workloads as they're deployed and back those up, right? We don't sit outside. We're not a third-party appliance. It also gives you freedom of choice, right? So pretty much every major Kubernetes distribution we support, as long as it has standard Kubernetes APIs. So if you're running in AWS EKS or Azure AKS or on-prem with something like OpenShift or even Rancher, SUSE Rancher, or just plain vanilla Kubernetes, we can back that up, right? Because we are a Kubernetes native app. Security everywhere. Obviously, that's a top point for this presentation. It should be for everybody, but obviously financial services, there is a certain layer, and security compliance, regulatory compliance we need to make sure we comply with. So really important that fundamentally within the product, we built a secure architecture, right? So great examples or small examples of this is that we have end-to-end encryption automatically built into the product, right? So when we replicate data, when we're moving it off-site, it's automatically encrypted. We obviously support third-party key management systems like HashiCorp Vault. We also, if you are an AWS customer, you can obviously use your customer managed keys. And we also support third-party integrations with things like Amazon GuardDuty, also Red Hat ACS if you're running OpenShift. So yes, definitely security first. We understand obviously data recovery, data reliability, security is fundamental to having a good backup and DR solution. Ease of use, right? So going back, this is kind of drop one thing here, but remember earlier slides we talked about lack of Kubernetes skill set. This is where ease of use really comes in, right? Having a simple UI, right? For your Kubernetes administrators, they're spending a lot of time in YAML and probably in command prompt, which is great. I love me some Bash, I love me some YAML, but at the same time, if I'm trying to do day two operations, trigger a backup or trigger recovery, it's nice to have that web UI. But going back to that Kubernetes native application, everything I do in the UI, I can export the YAML for, which obviously gives me a lot of flexibility, right? So think of, a dumb example, but if I want to run a cron job against kubectl, I can do that. And I can just pass my YAML files for a backup job or setting up a policy or anything that I can do in the Kasten UI. And of course, full ecosystem support, kind of alluded to this earlier. Basically, any Kubernetes distribution, we support a wide array of storage. Long story short, if your storage has a CSI driver, then we can basically integrate with that, right? So ideally, that CSI driver has volume snapshot support. That's pretty much the minimum we require within the CSI driver. And once we have that, we can obviously back up, snap, all of that. Aside from that, we also support Ceph. Also, any cloud native storage we can essentially back up. So moving right along, what is Kubernetes native backup, right? So a nice little diagram here. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but hopefully, high level, this makes sense, right? Especially if you've touched Kubernetes before, but if you haven't, let's dive in a little bit more. So you can see here, we have our Kubernetes distribution, second from the bottom. Supporting our Kubernetes distribution, we have our persistent storage, whether that's block or file storage. And then of course, at the top, another purple box there, that's our external storage target, right? So you'll often hear backup companies, especially Veeam and Kasten by Veeam, talk about the 3-2-1 principle, is that we want to make sure we have at least, I always get this wrong. We always it's obviously if working for a backup company is this should be tattooed on me, but you want to have at least one backup on two different types of media, and 3 backups, 2 different types of media, 1 offsite. There we go. All right. Sorry, guys. I need more coffee. But yeah, so, our external storage target, that could be something like S3 or NFS data store. That's where we get our offsite, right? So that's where our 1 comes from. You see the mention of blueprints here. That's really important and a key differentiator as well for Kasten by Veeam. So with the use of blueprints, we can take crash consistent snapshots, right? We're not just snapping storage. So if you're running some sort of data workload like Postgres or some sort of database where we need to quiesce the database, we can do that through the power of blueprints. You'll see also, aside from cloud native apps, if you're backing up deployments and pods within your infrastructure, we also support KubeVirt or KubeVirt virtual machines, right? So for those unaware, it's kind of come full circle. You can now run virtual machines within Kubernetes, right? So we're seeing things like OpenShift VM. So rather than just running containers, we can next to that kind of in parallel run VMs. Kasten fully supports backing those up as well. Nice little animation here, but yeah, we can extend, integrate, and automate there. So we talked about this a little bit earlier, but just to double down here, obviously early threat detection, we can raise early flags on potential malicious activity or imminent attacks, right? So working with things like Amazon GuardDuty or Red Hat ACS or previously StackRox, we can alert backup administrators, security teams. Hey, we see some malicious activity. We see things being deleted. You might want to take a look at this, right? So very important there. Otherwise, potentially gets lost in the noise, or you don't know until it's too late. Like as mentioned before, too, encrypted and immutable backups, right? So one benefit of using S3 storage for our offsite storage is that we can make sure that we have it's immutable, essentially. So once it's written, that read once, write many. To make sure that we have a safe and consistent copy of our application and data stored in the cloud or offsite. So obviously that's built in the product, and end-to-end encryption. Like I said, we do support HashiCorp Vault or Amazon CMK for customer managed keys. And of course, accelerated recovery, right? So we can quickly restore applications in the same or a different namespace. Great for testing, right? So the benefit of Kubernetes is we can just quickly spin up a new namespace, basically spin up our app, make sure it comes up without affecting production. Really good benefit there of obviously Kubernetes in general, but also using Kasten K10 for disaster recovery and data protection. So high level, to dig in a little bit more too, financial services industry, want to look a little bit at compliance standard. So before I start presenting the slide, as all of us know, working in FSI is typically these standards apply to organizational practices, not products. So while we can't say that Kasten is PCI DSS certified, it supports the larger ecosystem of your organization, making sure that it aligns to that payment card industry standard. So how, right? So obviously these are the standards on the left. On the right, we're going to say how Kasten can help with this. So number one, obviously build and maintain a secure network. For Kasten K10, we well document all of our network requirements, right? So if you have firewall or specific firewall requirements, it's easily documented within docs.kasten.io of what specific ports you need. So really useful there. You can make sure that we can maintain and help you align to your secure network requirements. Obviously, we need to protect cardholder data. Very important there. It's probably the core tenet. I'm actually kind of surprised it's not the first one within PCI DSS, but neither here nor there. So with Kasten, we obviously support end-to-end encryption. As mentioned before, too, we support customer managed keys as well, right? So great way to protect that data. In worst case scenario, if we've got that in an S3 bucket, that backup data is encrypted, right? So if somebody gets access to that, not only, number one, they have to get access to the data, but number two, they'll have to unencrypt it. So, obviously, we're making sure that we protect that cardholder data in the cloud. Maintaining a vulnerability management program. So this is obviously making sure, Kasten, one thing that we're very proud about is that we do releases every 2 weeks, right? So for things like, supply chain security for containers that are cropping up, for obviously the containers that we use within Kasten K10, we can make sure we are addressing those vulnerabilities as we do these 2-week releases. We're not waiting weeks or months having to use older container images or insecure configurations. So we definitely help you and your organization align to those vulnerability management programs. Obviously, implement strong access controls. This is another area that Kasten accelerates. We have granular RBAC. We integrate with Kubernetes native permissions and namespace enforcement. There's cluster role and role bindings directly within Kubernetes. We also integrate with third-party authentication providers, right? So if you're using OpenID, or if you can use Red Hat OpenShift's authentication mechanism as well. Fully integrate with that, right? So very important there. Again, making sure that we comply with those strong access control measures and also provide those audit logs as needed. Regularly monitoring test networks, as mentioned before, integration with Red Hat ACS and Amazon GuardDuty, right? So we can raise those alerts. We can make sure that we percolate up when we see suspicious behavior, but also have those audit logs for traceability. And lastly, but not least, maintain an information security policy. We leverage policy-driven backups, right, and DR to align to our business continuity and disaster recovery planning, right? So using policy-driven backups, we can focus on a namespace and ensure that we are meeting our SLA requirements, right? So obviously, one thing we often tell our customers is, make sure while DR is important and backups are important, it needs to be part of a bigger business continuity plan. Make sure you prioritize your apps, work with your business to ensure you have the right SLAs there. But because Kasten leverages those policy-driven backups, we can make sure that we are snapping our business critical apps more frequently and backing those up and setting them off site. Whereas maybe our dev or less business critical applications, we can apply different policies to. So really a lot of flexibility there. So going to buy versus build, right? Because this is another thing we often hear is, why would I buy Kasten when I can use Valero for free? Which is Valero, if you're not aware, is an open source solution for backup and recovery. This goes back to I think it's slide 3. We were talking about the lack of Kubernetes resources, right? So already organizations are stretched a little thin in terms of having Kubernetes resources within their organization, managing their environments, obviously managing their applications. The last thing you want to do is also have to care and feed your day 2 operations system, right? So yes, you can go grab Valero. You can spend hours, within YAML, but obviously there's no enterprise support. So if things go wrong, it's a little scary. But hey, maybe you really trust your BCDR and your ability to script. That's fine, but there's no UI or self-service. So let's say you are a backup admin or a Kubernetes admin, and you've deployed Valero. What happens if and when you leave your organization, or God forbid, a large bus comes rolling down the street one day? It becomes a risk of single point of failure. Obviously, with Kasten by Veeam, we have a nice friendly UI. We obviously have enterprise support to cover off those first 2. Obviously, no reporting or monitoring. It's possible, but not easy to integrate with third-party solutions for that logging. Whereas inherently within Kasten K10, we have things like Grafana and Prometheus integration, where we have those logged activities, and we can actually see as these backups are being performed and help troubleshoot as needed. You're also limited in terms of your transforms, which we'll take a look at the demo, but just know that it makes it a little bit tricky to move from one cloud to another, right? So obviously in-place backup's one thing, but be able to actually restore workloads on a different cloud, maybe that has a different number of worker nodes or different type of storage, that becomes very different. It's very difficult with open source solutions like Valero. And then, of course, limited consistency options. So we mentioned before with blueprints, the ability to be crash consistent, be able to leverage things like, it was the quiesce of a Postgres database, or if you have a Mongo database, making sure that we capture that in-memory data, right? Because if you just snap a database, oftentimes you will have things that are not yet written to disk. So when you go to restore, you may not have all your data there, or it may not be in a happy state. Lastly, kind of key, as I always say, Valero, is one of my colleagues likes to say, it's free like a puppy, right? So yes, open source, it's obviously free. You can download it, a great way to cut your teeth and have some fun, but aren't there other projects that would benefit from having additional innovation time if you didn't have to build a production ready backup and data recovery solution? So just think of opportunity cost, right? And hey, I'm guilty of it. I love to jump on the command line. I love open source projects. In my free time, I'm often playing with things like Home Assistants and open source home automation things, but it is a time suck, right? So just be aware that if you try to roll your own, that is a cost, right? So when you're doing that, you're not necessarily helping your organization manage those day 2 operations for the production or business critical apps. Moving right along. So we talked about our ecosystem and what we support. This is actually slightly out of date. This is actually a key responsibility of mine, is qualifying Kubernetes distributions and storage infrastructure. You'll see here, as mentioned before, from just not to jump too far ahead, but Kubernetes distributions, pretty much every major Kubernetes distribution we support, constantly adding new ones. A recent one that we just qualified, which hopefully you'll see some more, is Oracle's Kubernetes engine. We just confirmed that they are obviously compliant, and we can back up all workloads in OKE. Storage infrastructure as well. One of my key things is basically helping vendors look at their CSI driver, making sure we have that volume snapshot support. Once we have volume snapshot support, basically it's a supported driver. We can take those simple snapshots and recovery, and then obviously we can tie them with our blueprints if you have specific apps that need more than just snapshots. We talked about security a little bit on the right and data services on the left, just things that we support, right? So these advanced workloads, again, we're seeing more and more of these deployed to Kubernetes, which is great, but obviously we need to make sure that we can support those business critical apps. We can take those snapshots and recover in a crash consistent manner. So we're getting close to the demo, but wanted to talk about just, to kind of put the cherry on top, innovation at the speed of DevOps, right? So we talked about high level, from a cast and K10 perspective, what differentiates us, right? So we have things like fingerprinting. We can use automated blueprint application, right? So when you create these blueprints, we can say, hey, you've got multiple MySQL databases. You can reuse this blueprint across that. That saves you time and effort. We have a full transfer library, which we'll take a look at in the demo. But if you're restoring to a different Kubernetes cloud, like I said, if you've got fewer worker nodes, different storage backing, different networking, basically during the recovery, you can apply what's called transforms. So you're not having to manually go in, basically restore, and then having resources missing, or maybe your workload doesn't come up because the underlying storage isn't there. We can actually do that during recovery using simple transforms to make sure that your workloads come up quickly in the destination cloud. Obviously, policy as code and GitOps integration, working with things like Argo CD, we can fully integrate with your CI/CD pipeline, right? So making sure that, let's say your developers deploy a new app, we can make sure that a backup policy is applied at the time of deployment. Really nice there in terms of automation is that you don't have to worry about going back and tracing and trying to figure out, hey, what do I need to back up and what have you deployed as a developer? Because we are Kubernetes native, we can see those namespaces and we can automatically apply policies. And obviously, with policy as code, we can actually be more prescriptive in terms of what sort of policy we're applying to those workloads. SOC-friendly auditing integrations. So like I said, we can ship events into AWS Guard Duty and Red Hat OpenShift Advanced Cluster Security, or ACS, formerly StackRox. So really they're good for auditing and logging capabilities, right? Really important for financial services industry. Oftentimes we have a requirement to maintain data for 7 years. This ability to obviously integrate with those tools is really important. Secrets manager, as you said, end-to-end encryption. Built into the product, we have end-to-end encryption, but if you want to use your own keys, certainly supported. Like I said, HashiCorp Vault, AWS secrets manager as well, to make sure that we are using your secret as needed. Ecosystem expansion, like I said, we do releases every 2 weeks. We are constantly qualifying new Kubernetes releases, new OpenShift releases, new storage. I'm actually working on a number of validated designs. So we have the Cisco hybrid cloud right now, working with a number of other industry vendors as well to create some of those validated designs for you. And then, of course, OpenShift virtualization, right? So kind of full circle now, we are deploying VMs within Kubernetes. So full support for backing up those VM workloads directly within Kubernetes. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into a quick demo. We'll take a look at how we can actually take a workload on a source cluster and restore it to a destination cluster, maybe in the case of going from dev to prod, or maybe we need to go from somewhere that's got limited resources to more expansive resources. So let's take a look real quick at a quick demo of Cast and K10 and how we can help you with that. All right, guys, so this is our quick demo. Obviously, financial services, we decided to use a sock shop app, but insert what you want here to demonstrate that we have persistent data deployed within Kubernetes. You can see I've got a number of orders in place here. I love me some socks, but we need to move this application to a different cluster, right? So you can see we are in Red Hat's console here. Let's say we want to try Red Hat's OpenShift on AWS or ROSA. You can see here, I'm going to go ahead and say create cluster with a web interface. Obviously, the benefit of Red Hat OpenShift is it makes it super easy to deploy these clusters, right? So I've got my sock shop app. I can obviously specify my worker nodes. Maybe I need to scale out. We're getting close to the holidays, and I need to make sure that I can sell some socks. So I'm deploying a new cluster, many worker nodes. We're going to fast forward a little bit here, but relatively quickly, I think within an hour, we get this cluster up. While that's spinning in the background, I'm going to go to my source casting K10. Here's my sock shop backup. I'm going to go ahead and set up a migration policy here. So I'm going to set it as on demand and enable backups via snapshot exports and export this to an immutable S3 bucket. Pretty straightforward. You can see the namespace here. I'm going to back up all resources and create that policy. And then I'm going to go ahead and run this. And this will actually back up my sock shop app, all of its persistent data. Remember those orders that I had in there. I want to make sure that comes up on my destination side. So I can monitor here in the interface this job. You'll see it kicks off a number of actions. Again, I've got my nice friendly UI. You'll see that my backup and exports have all succeeded. So my data is now successfully up in S3. And it's not just the volume data. We also have the application definitions as well, things like our services and our pods and whatnot. So we've got my OpenShift ROSA console deployed. So this is, again, is OpenShift on AWS. Let's go ahead and log in. We've got just token-based authentication. You'll see here in terms of operators, I can easily deploy casting K10, right? It is an operator within OpenShift's marketplace. Super simple to install. I can literally click install. It's very quick. In the background, it is pulling down cast and deploying on this cluster. I can view the operator here and then jump over and just create a quick K10 instance. You'll see here I've got a couple authentication options for this demo. Let's go ahead and just do token-based auth and enable our K10 dashboard via a route. So I'll take a minute or two, and then we'll let this deploy. You can obviously monitor this within the Red Hat OpenShift console. Looking pretty good here. We're initialized and deployed. And we'll go ahead and head to networking and take a look at routes and filter our project to cast in K10. Look at that. We've got our URL. I've got my token, which is part of my OpenShift cluster. And now I am in my new instance of casting K10. And first thing I'm going to do is set up a location profile. So remember that S3 bucket that we exported to. I'm going to essentially set up a pointer to that same bucket. There's my immutable S3. I've got my access key and my secret. I'll choose my region as well. And note that we can also now support IAM as well. So if you can see that checkbox in the bottom, if you don't want to use a secret and key there, we can do more dynamic authentication there for a bucket. So we've set up our profile. Let's go ahead and create a policy. So this policy is going to be our restore job, right? So we're going to import from that S3 bucket, go ahead and set it to on demand, much like our export job on the other side. I'm going to head back to my other instance and grab my import details. So this is my encryption key. So as mentioned before, we have end-to-end encryption. So I'm going to configure that from my bucket and say create policy. Now let's go ahead and run it once. What this should do is reseed the data within K10. Basically, K10 also deploys this within our Kubernetes cluster, right? Again, in this case, it's ROSA, so OpenShift on AWS. And go back here, we can monitor the policies and see here if we've got our applications. I need to find sock shop. You can see it's inherently because it was just imported, not there. So if I go to removed, I can now import it directly into K10. And then here's my import, right? So this is the one that I just took on my source side. So I'll go ahead and deploy a new namespace called sock shop and go ahead and apply transforms. So I need to apply these transforms because I'm coming from a different source. So at the source, we're using vSphere. So you'll see here, I need to change my storage class, right? So I've got a number of actions here that I can do within my transform. Let's go ahead and change our storage class name. It's a simple, think of it as like a sed command. We're going to change to GP2, which is available within AWS. And we're going to go ahead and replace our vSphere CSI. You can see here, I can test this, and we've got our new storage type. So say close and create transform. I'm going to create one more transform, and it's because it's essentially networking, right? So on our source side, we need to make sure we remove any existing routes. We're going to let OpenShift within ROSA automatically deploy its own route. Again, pretty straightforward here. I can test this. I can see there's my spec. And then essentially it's just completely removed, and we know OpenShift will go ahead and deploy a new route for us. So here's all the resources being restored. As mentioned before, it's not just persistent data, it's also our application data. I'm going to go untick that storage class because we obviously don't have that backing storage in AWS. And go ahead and kick off. You can see the restore operation here. It moves pretty quickly. And then if I go ahead and go to my pods, you'll see these being spun up, right? So my sock shop. Automatically containers are creating. You can see they're spinning up. They're going to spin down, then spin up as they get configured. There we go. Moving to the running state. That is always good. There's no crash loop back off. Always good to see running. And then if I take a look down here at networking and go to routes, there's my URL for my sock shop app. So I'll click on that. Here's our socks. Here's our app. It's up. We're ready to start taking more orders for the big holiday season. Taking that credit card information, and we are good to go. And then, of course, there's my persistent data, my orders that I had there before. And yeah, those are some super sport XLs. Love those. So that's our demo, guys. I appreciate you jumping in with that. Let's go ahead and move over to a Q&A while I actually check out. Like I said, I love some socks, so I'm going to purchase some more here just while we're doing our demo here. But with that, we're going to head over to our Q&A, and let's go ahead and take a look at some questions in the chat.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, great demo, great presentation.
There we go. That's the slide I wanted. That's right.
There we go. I was waiting for that slide. All right, super. Yeah, so we do have a few questions here from the audience. They're wondering, can Kasten ensure that our data stays on shore per our regulatory requirements?
Good question. Yep, we definitely see a lot of data sovereignty requirements, especially in the financial services industry. And absolutely, yes, right. So we can make sure, if you're deployed to a public cloud like AWS, we can make sure that, if you're in GovCloud, obviously, we'll make sure we stay in GovCloud. Same thing, obviously you can go across region, but if let's say you're in Western Europe, maybe we need to keep something within country. That is fully, obviously fully possible with the public cloud providers, as well as obviously if you're rolling your own or have your own Kubernetes instance, that's kind of a non-issue. But yes, through our backup policies, we can definitely ensure maybe you have certain workloads that need data sovereignty and some that don't. We obviously can support different backup destinations and ensure that those policies make sure your data is compliant and onshore where it needs to be.
Gotcha. And based on your background, you're the guy to ask about that. So good question. What sort of off-site data repositories does Kasten support, whether public or private cloud?
Great question. Yeah. So we obviously support any S3 compatible storage. So obviously it doesn't need to have immutability, although that's obviously highly recommended in the case of backup and recovery workloads. Out of the box, AWS S3 is an obvious one. We see that a lot with our customers just because, again, you've got that availability. Obviously, Amazon handles it for you, but there's nothing stopping you from deploying something like MinIO in your own data center. Obviously, that's all S3 compatible storage with immutability. We do support Azure Blob storage as well, going back to public cloud. All that aside, too, we also support NFS, right? So most organizations have some sort of NFS as well, whether in their data center. Obviously, there's cloud NFS data options as well. Obviously, the risk around using NFS is just a lack of immutability. So keep that in mind, but we do support that as a destination data source, or data destination, rather.
Gotcha. Thanks. And that point you made about NFS makes me wonder, what are some of the pros and cons of, keeping your backups on the same platform versus putting them somewhere else?
Absolutely. It goes back to that 3-2-1 rule that I struggled through so hard. But yeah, you want to make sure you have at least 3 copies of your data. Obviously, we want 2 different types of media. So back in the day, 2 types of media may have been spitting disk and tape. And actually, fun story about that, not to get too off the rails, but the large APAC bank I worked for, they actually had a tape robot in the data center that it was like every hour would grab tapes and rotate them. So that was early, well before AI, or I guess that is a type of AI. But anyways, to your point, Scott, make sure, obviously the benefit is we need to make sure we have that 1 copy of data offsite. Right. So, if we store everything in our data center, let's say everything is in site A, whether that's, again, it could be even a public cloud provider. It's obviously it tends to have a little bit more benefit with our availability up there. But if we have everything in one data center, there's that smoking hole scenario, as we say, where maybe something happens and we lose all power, or there's massive flooding and, for whatever reason, our single data center goes down. Obviously, if all of our data is in that data center, then we are going to be out of luck. So, if you have a primary and secondary data center, that is why, right, for that resilience. So, always good to replicate data. We do see customers too that run production workloads in both data centers, which is great. And then obviously they can replicate data vice versa, right? So data center A sending to data center B and vice versa. And like I said, obviously too, with things like AWS S3 or Azure Blob, that's a great way to ensure that you've got that at least one copy completely offsite.
Gotcha. Thanks. Yeah, we've got another question here, and you kind of touched on this, but it's sort of first principles, and it's probably worth redoing. It's just they're wondering if you could recap the key differences between regular backup and Kubernetes backup.
Great question. Yeah. So, I mean, it goes back to, I think, earlier where some organizations think that you can use traditional backup for Kubernetes backup, which you might be able to, right? There is a chance that if you try to snap your worker node and etcd, and there is a very slight chance everything comes up and you're just in good shape. But generally speaking, the architecture is fundamentally different, right? So if I'm trying to take a snapshot, let's say I'm running my worker nodes as virtual machines in something like vSphere, and I try to snap those VMs and then restore them on a destination site. There's no guarantee, across worker nodes. Let's say I've got a pod that's got, I've got a replica set that's got 3 instances within my pod, but I've got 6 worker nodes. We don't really know which worker nodes that application is deployed on. So, obviously you can snap all the worker nodes and bring them up. But, one thing about the ephemeral nature of Kubernetes is when they come up, on the destination side, they may not be on the same worker nodes. And same goes for etcd, right? So we do have a number of customers that say, hey, we just back up etcd. That's where the brains of Kubernetes live, so I should be fine. The problem with that is when you're backing up etcd, persistent data, persistent volume PVCs, persistent volume claims, may not be backed up. And it's kind of the allegory we say, it's the same thing as saying, hey, I snapshot vCenter and therefore I am protected, right? That's obviously not the case. There is a fundamental different architecture, and we need to make sure that we align to that Kubernetes distributed architecture.
Great, thanks. That's really helpful. Another question here. They're wondering, you showed a graphic with the Kasten architecture and the blueprints, and they're wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what the blueprints are, and how that works.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's a very powerful tool. Definitely among enterprises, very important as well for those persistent storage workloads, or those advanced workloads. Like if you're running a Redis database, or running MySQL is the classic example, or my favorite Postgres, and you need to quiesce that database. Think of Kubernetes aside. Think of either VMs, taking a snapshot of a Microsoft SQL or Postgres VM. It's important that we capture or at least calm the disk before we take the snapshot. It's the same principle within Kubernetes, right? So, but we need to be able to have that capability built in, which is exactly what we can do with blueprints, right? So kind of having that introspection into the application, running application-specific or necessitated tools before we take our backup. And that's what ensures that we can obviously recover, right? So back to the earlier point, backups are only good if you can recover from them. That's a great example of why blueprints are really important, is for those advanced workloads to make sure that we have a good backup of that application.
Awesome, thanks. Next question here: can Kasten back up VMs?
Great question. Yes. So yes. So, and let me step back to, so obviously, so Kasten by Veeam, we are a Veeam company. Veeam did purchase us a few years ago. So if you're looking at just traditional VM, I shouldn't say just, if you're looking at traditional VM infrastructure, things on vSphere, whether you're in Hyper-V, that traditional VM backup, obviously Veeam can handle with VBR, their Veeam backup and recovery, but also, leaning forward a little bit now that we can deploy VMs within, KubeVirt, right? So within Kubernetes, actually deploy VMs next to our containerized workloads. Kasten fully supports that, right? So we actually treat that pretty much the same as a persistent volume, right? We can back up the disks that are attached to those VMs. So yes, we can back up those VMs. So it's kind of a good 1-2 punch, right? So a great example of, if you have Veeam today and you're starting to deploy Kubernetes, definitely look at Kasten, or vice versa, right? So if you're a Kubernetes forward shop, but you've got some legacy VMs or even physical infrastructure, Veeam obviously has you covered on that front.
Gotcha. Super. One of the things that you mentioned, was the open source options and how long those typically take. With Kasten, how long does it take to set up? And I understand like every environment's different, but are there any rules of thumb as far as what kind of time you should expect?
Great question. It's one of the reasons I joined the company was just because of like how simple it was, right? I'm obviously a big believer. I work for the product team, full disclosure, but obviously I personally want to believe in the product. And one key part of that is, how difficult really is it to set up? The beautiful thing about Kasten K10 is for deployment, our typical deployment most of our customers use our Helm chart. So in terms of deployment, as long as you have a working Kubernetes instance and you've got Helm installed, I'd say you can usually get the install done within 15 minutes. And obviously we're looking at marketplaces like that OpenShift marketplace we saw in the demo. It's about the same, right? So we're looking at about 15 minutes to deploy. Up and running, we've got our UI up, and then we can actually start configuring policies. So yeah, in contrast with those open source solutions, again, I love open source, but you're often spending some time configuring it for your environment, deep in YAML, and everyone loves space delineation. But it is nice to be able to just do a Helm install and have that done in 10 to 15 minutes as those containers spin up.
Awesome. Okay. Here's one. Which security solutions can Kasten integrate with?
Good question. Yeah, so we are working to add more and more. I think out of the box today, we support things like AWS Guard Duty. For monitoring and auditing purposes, OpenShift, Advanced Cluster Security or ACS, previously StackRox, fully integrate with that. You can leverage things like Argo CD for your CI/CD pipelines for automated policy deployment, or automated policy implementation. And then, of course, like I said, for key management, we can do customer managed keys with AWS. We support HashiCorp Vault as well. and we are looking to add additional integrations. So stay tuned. I don't want to get ahead of myself too much, but yeah, definitely have a look in the next few weeks. We should see more and more SIEM integrations, SIEM. So yeah, definitely some fun things coming down the pipe there. As we see those ransomware attacks tick up, we need to make sure we stay ahead of that and are able to both recover and audit those events to make sure we have a full secure solution.
Fantastic. Well, we're coming up on time here, but we've got a slide up with the VR code. If somebody wants to get started with Kasten, what can they find? On this or QR code. I said VR code. What can they find on this QR code, and any other recommendations for us as next steps?
Awesome. Yeah. So if you are just dipping your toes in Kubernetes, we actually have this QR code. Won't send it to you, but just this will let you download essentially a fully featured up to 5 nodes Kasten K10. I think the first time I installed the product, I used Minikube. So we deployed a Minikube. It uses the host path CSI. But yeah, it's as mentioned, it's fully featured up to 5 worker nodes. And yeah, really easy to get started. Like I said, the install is Helm command. And yeah, out of the box, 5 worker nodes free. So check it out. Even if you just want to kick the tires, like I said, Minikube's a great way to get started. And obviously, if you have your own Kubernetes distribution already deployed, it makes it even easier. You don't have to worry about the underlying Minikube or K3S or whatever you're deploying.
Great. All right. Well, Matt, thanks so much for being here, bringing us up to speed on Kasten. And great demo, great presentation. Really appreciate your time.
No worries. Thank you, Scott. And thank you, everybody, for attending. Have a great rest of your afternoon, evening, wherever you are. And yeah, appreciate the time.
And before we wrap up, we have one more piece of business. It's the Amazon gift card prize drawing. And the winner of that $250 Amazon gift card today is Jeremy Reed from Idaho. So congratulations to Jeremy Reed. We'll be in touch about getting you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Kasten by Veeam for making this event possible. And thanks as always for attending and for your great questions. That concludes today's event. Have a great rest of your day.